The man who ran every morning at 5:45 had a secret no one on the street suspected. The ambulance came without sirens. That was the first thing the neighbours noticed. Not the flashing lights, not the crunch of tyres on the frost-hardened street, but the silence. An ambulance moving through a neighbourhood at 6:47 in the morning with its lights on and its siren off means only one thing. Everyone on Calloway Street understood that, even if none of them said it out loud while standing in their driveways in their coats, coffee mugs going cold in their hands. The front door of the house at number 44 was open. Not broken open, just open, the way a door gets left when someone stepped out for a moment and never stepped back in. The screen door behind it shifted slightly in the October wind, tapping against the frame in a slow, irregular rhythm. One of the dogs, the older one, the brown lab with the greying muzzle, was sitting on the porch, not pacing, not barking, just sitting, facing the street, watching the paramedics the way dogs watch things they don't have words for. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The paramedics were inside for 11 minutes. Nobody on the street counted. It just became clear afterward, when people compared what they remembered, that 11 minutes had passed between when the two men walked through that front door and when they came back out. They came back out without the gurney moving fast. They came back out the way people move when the urgency is already over. His name was Daniel Reeves. He was 41 years old, and that is where the confusion starts. Because the people who lined both sides of Calloway Street that morning, the retired couple from number 39, the young woman from 47 who had her toddler on her hip, the man from across the street who had watched Daniel Reeves leave for a run at 5:45 every single morning for 4 years without exception. None of them could make what they were seeing fit with what they knew. Daniel Reeves ran a half marathon every spring. He had finished 3 of them. His finishing times were pinned to the corkboard inside his garage, visible through the window when the door was up. He had a vegetable garden along the south side of his house that produced more tomatoes each August than one man could possibly eat. So he left paper bags of them on neighbours' porches without knocking. He was lean in the way that comes from actual use of a body, not from a gym membership. His resting heart rate, which he mentioned once at a block party without bragging about it, was 48 beats per minute. 48 beats per minute. The heart of a distance runner. The man from across the street, the one who had watched those 5:45 departures for 4 years, stood at the edge of his driveway and tried to locate something, any detail, any moment, any morning that should have told him what was happening inside that house. He went back through 4 years of casual observation and found nothing that fit. Daniel Reeves waved from the driveway. Daniel Reeves nodded at the mailbox. Daniel Reeves carried groceries from his car in reusable bags with the handles looped over both forearms. He looked like a man who read the nutritional information on packaging. He looked like a man who slept 8 hours and meant to. He looked, in every observable way, like the healthiest person on the street. The coroner's report, released 6 weeks after that Tuesday morning, listed the cause of death as acute opioid toxicity, accidental. The toxicology screen found fentanyl and heroin in Daniel Reeves's blood at levels that stopped his breathing while he was sitting in the armchair in his living room, the television on, the volume low, the remote still in his right hand. The older dog was found on the porch. The younger one, a black terrier mix 3 years old, was found sitting next to the armchair. Both dogs were taken in by Daniel's sister, who drove from Pittsburgh the following morning and sat in the driveway of number 44 for nearly an hour before she went inside. A heroin overdose. In a house with a vegetable garden and marathon certificates on the corkboard, and a kitchen that, according to the neighbour who helped the sister carry things out 3 weeks later, was stocked with steel-cut oats and olive oil and a water filter on the tap. This is the part that doesn't make sense from the outside. This is the part that made the man across the street go back inside his own house and sit at his kitchen table and stay there for a long time, turning one question over and over in his mind like a stone he couldn't put down. How long had it been happening inside that house? Not the overdose, not the final night, the whole of it. The thing that built toward that armchair, that television, that remote control held loosely in a hand that had stopped gripping. Something had been moving through Daniel Reeves's life for longer than one evening, longer than one bad decision, longer than whatever narrow story people reach for when they hear the word heroin and picture a face that doesn't look like their neighbour's. The man across the street had watched Daniel leave for a run 400 and something times. He had never once seen what Daniel was running from. Calloway Street sat on the western edge of a suburb called Merton Heights, about 22 miles outside Columbus, Ohio. It was the kind of place where the houses were built in the late 90s, all roughly the same footprint, differentiated only by the colour of the shutters and what people had done with their front yards over time. The streets curved gently without sharp corners. There were 2 parks within walking distance, an elementary school 3 blocks east, and a grocery store that had been a different grocery store twice, before finally settling into what it was now. Nothing about it announced itself. It was exactly what it looked like. Daniel Reeves moved to Calloway Street in the spring of 2014, 8 months after his divorce from Carol was finalised. He arrived with a moving truck, 2 dogs, a set of road bikes hung on a wall-mount rack, and enough kitchen equipment to suggest a person who cooked seriously and often. The neighbours who watched him move in that Saturday saw a man who carried his own boxes without asking for help, organised them by room before opening a single one, and had the furniture arranged and the truck returned before 6 in the evening. He introduced himself to the people on either side of him that same day. He remembered their names the next time he saw them. Within a month the garden appeared. He built it himself along the south-facing side of the house. Raised beds, cedar framing, proper drainage holes, a drip irrigation line he ran from the outdoor spigot himself on a Sunday afternoon. By August of that first year, the tomato plants were taller than the fence line. He left a paper bag of them on the porch of the retired couple at number 39 without a note. Just a bag of tomatoes sitting there in the morning like something that had always been there. The man from across the street, his name was Greg Paulson, and he had lived at number 43 for 11 years, noticed Daniel Reeves for the first time not because of the garden, but because of the running. It was a Tuesday in June, 5:43 in the morning, still dark enough that Greg could see the small headlamp clipped to Daniel's cap bobbing down the street toward the park trail. Greg was up early because his back had been giving him trouble, and lying down had stopped helping. He watched that headlamp disappear around the curve at the end of Calloway and thought nothing particular about it. The next morning it was there again, and the morning after that, it became, over time, a kind of fixed point in Greg's early mornings, the headlamp, or in summer the reflective strips on Daniel's shoes, moving down the street at precisely the same time, 5 days a week, rain adjusted for but not cancelled. This was not recreational running. The consistency of it told Greg that much. A person runs for recreation when they feel like it. Daniel Reeves ran the way people go to work. He was a project manager at a mid-sized logistics company called Meridian Freight Solutions, based in an office park off the highway about 12 miles from Calloway Street. He had worked there for 6 years. His co-workers described him, when they were later asked, as someone who did exactly what he said he would do by the time he said he would do it, without requiring follow-up. In an office, that quality makes a person nearly invisible, not because they are unremarkable, but because they generate no friction, no drama, nothing that demands attention. Daniel Reeves, at Meridian, was the kind of colleague people realised they relied on only when he wasn't there. He had one close friend at work. His name was Nate Fowler, late 30s, married, 2 kids in middle school, the kind of man who kept a bag of beef jerky in his desk drawer and remembered everyone's coffee order. Nate and Daniel had lunch together most Tuesdays at a sandwich place 2 blocks from the office. They had been doing that for 4 years. They talked about work, about the kids' sports, about the logistics industry, about nothing in particular. Nate would say later that he had never once felt like he didn't know Daniel. He would also say, quietly, that he'd been wrong about that. The divorce from Carol had been, by all outward appearances, handled with the same efficiency Daniel brought to everything else. Papers filed, assets divided, a custody arrangement that put their 2 kids, a daughter, Maya, who was 9 at the time, and a son, Owen, who was 7, with Carol during the school week and with Daniel on alternate weekends and through most of the summer. No court battles, no scenes at handoffs. The neighbours on Carroll Street, a different neighbourhood across town, saw 2 people who had learned to be functional strangers in close proximity, and they called it mature. What they didn't see, what almost nobody saw, was what it cost Daniel to be alone in that house at number 44 after the kids left on Sunday evenings. He had moved to Calloway Street, bought the cedar for the garden, hung the bikes on the wall, run 5 mornings a week, and built a life that looked from every observable angle like a man who had handled something hard and come out the other side intact. The structure of it was meticulous. The running, the garden, the cooking, the consistent work performance, the prompt responses to emails. Every element of his daily existence was organised, maintained, loaded with purpose. Greg Paulson, watching from number 43, saw a man who had his life together in a way that made his own feel slightly less organised by comparison. He never thought to ask what all that structure was holding back. Daniel's mother, Sandra Reeves, had died of a cardiac event when Daniel was 14 years old. She'd been 41, the same age Daniel would be when the ambulance came down Calloway Street without its sirens. His father, a steelworker named Roy, had raised Daniel and his younger sister Linda in Dayton, Ohio, in a 3-bedroom house where the heat sometimes ran short in February. Roy Reeves was not a man who processed grief in ways that were visible to his children. He processed it in other ways, and Daniel had watched him do that from the time he was 14 until the time he left for college at 18. What Daniel took from those 4 years, and what he did with what he took, was something he never discussed with anyone on Calloway Street. He barely discussed it with Carol during 11 years of marriage. Linda Reeves, reached by phone 6 weeks after her brother's death, said one thing that lodged itself in the mind of everyone who heard it. She said that Daniel had always been the person in the room who looked the most okay. Not the happiest, just the most okay, the most composed, the most capable of making a situation feel manageable. She said she had thought that was a strength. There was a voicemail on her phone from Daniel, left 3 weeks before he died. She had listened to it twice when it arrived, and had not yet called him back at the time of his death. The voicemail was 4 minutes and 20 seconds long. She did not describe its contents to anyone, not even at the funeral. Whatever Daniel Reeves said in those 4 minutes and 20 seconds, he said it 4 weeks before the ambulance came, and Linda Reeves, who knew her brother better than almost anyone alive, heard it twice and still did not call. It happened on a Saturday morning in April, 3 years before the ambulance came down Calloway Street. Daniel was at mile 9 of a half marathon outside Columbus, the Scioto Valley Spring Run, a mid-sized event, around 1,400 participants, a course that wound along the river and back through a park. He had run it twice before. His goal that year was to finish under 1 hour and 58 minutes, which would have been a personal best by 4 minutes. He was on pace. His split at mile 8 had been exactly where he needed it to be. At mile 9, on a slight downhill where the trail curved left toward the river, his right knee gave way. Not gradually. Not a slow build of warning pain that a person could run through or adjust around. It went sideways, a single motion, the leg buckling outward in a way the knee is not designed to move, and Daniel was on the ground before he had fully processed the sound it made. A partial ACL tear, the orthopedic surgeon would confirm 3 days later. Significant enough to require reconstruction. Recovery time, 6 to 9 months, minimum, before returning to any impact activity. He had the surgery on a Thursday in May. Nate Fowler drove him home from the hospital that afternoon, which was the kind of thing Nate did without being asked. He helped Daniel get settled on the couch, put the prescribed medications on the kitchen counter with a glass of water beside them, made sure the dogs were fed. He stayed for about 40 minutes and then left, because Daniel had indicated without saying anything directly that he wanted to be alone. The prescription was for oxycodone, 30 tablets, 5 milligrams, to be taken every 4 to 6 hours as needed for pain. The surgeon's office called it standard post-operative protocol. For a procedure of that type, at that time, in that state, it was, statistically, procedurally, completely, standard. The first pill Daniel took was that Thursday evening, 40 minutes after Nate left. What happened in the following hours was not dramatic. No revelation, no sudden change in personality, no visible transformation. He sat on the couch with his leg elevated on 2 pillows and the television on, and the pain in his knee, which had been a sharp and constant presence since the surgery, began to recede. That part was expected. That part was the point. What was not expected, what Daniel had no framework for, no warning about, no language to describe, was the other thing the medication did. Beneath the physical relief, something else shifted, a low-level pressure that had been running underneath his daily life for a long time, something he had managed through structure and distance and 5:45 morning runs, loosened its grip in a way that he had not felt in years. He noticed it the way you notice a sound stopping, only after it was gone. He lay on that couch with his knee elevated and the television murmuring and felt, for the first time in a period he could not have precisely named, something close to quiet. Within 2 weeks the surgical pain had decreased substantially. He kept taking the pills on schedule. By the end of the first month, Nate noticed something at the office that he couldn't immediately name. Daniel was arriving at work with his collar buttoned differently, or his desk organised in a slightly different configuration, or something equally minor and hard to articulate. Just an overall impression that the man seemed lighter, more present, more willing to linger after a meeting to talk about nothing in particular. Nate mentioned it to his wife that evening, framing it as a good thing. He said Daniel seemed better than before the injury. His wife asked what he meant by better. Nate thought about it and said he wasn't sure. Just better. More relaxed. Like something had let go. She said that was good, wasn't it? Nate said yes. He assumed it was the rest. That Daniel had finally been forced to slow down, and slowing down had done him good. It was a reasonable explanation. It fit what Nate could see. He filed it there and moved on. What Nate could not see was the notebook Daniel had started keeping on the nightstand beside his bed. A small spiral-bound notebook, the kind sold in packs of 3 at a drugstore, where he had begun writing down the time he took each pill and the pain level before and after, on a scale he had invented himself, running from 1 to 10. The entries were precise and consistent. The handwriting was neat. By week 6 of recovery, some of the entries had begun to include a second number. Not the knee pain, which by then was manageable, but something else he had started tracking. A different kind of discomfort. One that had no surgical origin. He didn't name it in the notebook. He just tracked it. The prescription ran out on a Wednesday in July. He had stretched it further than instructed, not by doubling doses, but by spacing them more carefully, timing them to last longer, the way a person rations something they're not sure they can replace. His follow-up appointment was the following Monday. He asked the surgeon's office for a refill at the end of that appointment, describing residual knee discomfort he said was interfering with his physical therapy. The surgeon examined the joint, noted that healing was progressing well, and declined to prescribe more opioids. He offered an anti-inflammatory instead. He also mentioned that Daniel's physical therapist had reported no indication of unusual pain levels during their sessions. Daniel took the anti-inflammatory prescription, folded it twice, put it in his jacket pocket, and drove home. He didn't fill it. The following Thursday, he sat in his kitchen at 11 in the evening, not his usual bedtime, not his usual room, and stayed there for 2 hours. He was not reading. He was not on his phone. The kitchen light was on. The rest of the house was dark, and from the street it would have looked like any house where someone was up late. Greg Paulson, across the street, was not awake to see it. Nobody was watching the house on Calloway Street that night. That would become relevant. Later, much later, it would matter enormously that nobody was paying attention to what was happening inside number 44 during those quiet hours when Daniel Reeves sat alone in his kitchen and worked out, in the privacy of his own careful mind, what he was going to do next. The anti-inflammatory sat in his jacket pocket for 11 days before he threw it away. Something was being decided in those 11 days. Something that would take 3 more years to fully arrive. The structure of Daniel's life, the running and the garden and the 5:45 mornings, had been built piece by piece over years for reasons he had never explained to anyone on Calloway Street. With the running gone and the pills gone and the knee slowly healing, something underneath all that structure had begun to surface. What it was, and how long it had actually been there, was a question Daniel had been postponing since he was 14 years old. To understand what happened next inside number 44, it helps to understand what oxycodone actually does to a human brain. Not in clinical terms, but in terms of what a person experiences when they take it. The brain has receptors specifically designed to receive opioid signals. They exist because the body produces its own versions, natural chemicals released during intense exercise, during physical pain, during moments of connection with other people. These receptors, when activated, do several things simultaneously. They suppress pain, they reduce anxiety, and they produce a feeling that researchers describe in dry language as reward, but which, in practice, feels to the person experiencing it like a profound and total okayness. Not euphoria, necessarily. Not a high in the dramatic sense. Just the sudden, complete absence of whatever had been wrong. For most people, that feeling is temporary and mild. The pain medication works, the pain recedes, the medication wears off, life resumes. For some people, and the number is not small, and the factor that determines which category a person falls into is not willpower or character or intelligence. The brain responds differently. It recognizes the chemical signal as something it has been waiting for. It responds with an efficiency and an enthusiasm that has nothing to do with the person's choices and everything to do with the particular architecture of their neurology. Daniel Reeves's brain, for reasons that were encoded long before he ever ran a half marathon, or built a garden, or moved to Calloway Street, was that second kind. He did not know this. His surgeon did not know this. Nobody in his life knew this. It is not the kind of thing that shows up in a physical or a blood panel or a conversation about post-operative pain management. It only becomes visible after the fact, when the trajectory of a person's behavior is laid out and the shape of it becomes clear. After the prescription ended and the refill was denied, Daniel spent approximately 3 weeks in a state that had no name in his daily vocabulary. His knee was healing. His physical therapy was progressing. From the outside, his recovery was going exactly as planned. He returned to work full-time. He answered emails. He made his Tuesday lunches with Nate. He was present, functional, unremarkable in the way that had always defined him at Meridian. At home, in the evenings, after the dogs were fed and the house was quiet, he sat with something that felt like the removal of the medication, but was actually something older surfacing through the gap it had left. A persistent low-frequency discomfort, not physical, not locatable in any specific part of the body, but total and enveloping in the way that only things with deep roots can be. He had felt this before. He knew its shape. He found another source of pills within those 3 weeks. Not on a street corner, not through any dramatic underworld transaction. Through a co-worker, a man in the logistics department named Terry Grasso, who was known at Meridian for 2 things: an encyclopedic knowledge of regional trucking routes and a looseness about certain informal arrangements that had existed quietly in his life for years. Daniel approached him not with any obvious desperation, but with the same calm and measured manner he brought to everything. He framed it as a recovery issue, a prescription gap, a temporary inconvenience while his doctor sorted out a longer-term pain management plan. Terry Grasso had heard versions of that story before. He made a call. Within 4 days, Daniel had a new supply. The pills were the same milligram as his prescription. They came in an unmarked Ziploc bag rather than an orange pharmacy bottle, and they cost significantly more per tablet. Daniel paid without negotiating. He went home, put them in the back of the medicine cabinet behind a box of cold medicine that had been there since the previous winter, and took one that evening with a glass of water. The relief was immediate. The quiet returned. This is the part of opioid dependence that is almost never depicted accurately: the functional phase. Daniel's life in the months following this arrangement did not deteriorate. It held. He took the pills at consistent intervals, managing his consumption against his supply with the same precision he brought to project timelines at work. He understood, at some level he did not examine directly, that the supply was finite and variable, and that this required careful stewardship. The notebook on the nightstand continued filling up. Numbers, times, intervals. The handwriting stayed neat. His knee healed enough that he returned to walking seriously by September. Short runs by November, nothing near half-marathon distance, but enough that Greg Paulson saw the headlamp moving down Calloway Street again on a Tuesday morning, and felt, without knowing why, a small and uncomplicated relief. While Daniel rebuilt his routine on Calloway Street, something much larger was moving through the state he lived in. Ohio had been at the center of the opioid crisis since the early 2000s, when a pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma began aggressively marketing a time-release oxycodone product called OxyContin to doctors across the country. The sales pitch, repeated in doctors' offices and at medical conferences and in printed materials, distributed by pharmaceutical representatives, was specific and emphatic. The time-release formula made the drug non-addictive. Patients would get the pain relief without the dependency risk. Doctors could prescribe freely. This claim was false. Purdue Pharma knew it was false. Internal documents, later obtained through litigation, showed that the company's own researchers had flagged the addiction risk years before the drug went to market. The marketing campaign ran anyway, backed by a sales force that was trained to overcome physician hesitation and incentivized with bonuses tied directly to prescription volume. In the counties surrounding Columbus alone, opioid prescriptions increased by over 300% between 1999 and 2010. Doctors who'd been cautious about prescribing opioids were reassured by the pharmaceutical representatives sitting across their desks that caution was unnecessary. Patients who became dependent were often simply given more prescriptions because dependency looked like pain, and the guidance they had received told them pain was what they were treating. By the time the FDA and state medical boards began tightening prescription regulations in the early 2000s, millions of people were physically dependent on opioids they had been prescribed by their doctors for legitimate medical conditions. Then the prescription started drying up. The pain did not. Nate Fowler, who knew none of this history in any systematic way, noticed something in Daniel around this same period, the fall of the year after the surgery, that he would describe later as a kind of smoothness. Daniel had always been competent and composed, but there was something slightly more frictionless about him now, something that made him easier to be around in a surface way, while also, somehow, harder to reach. Nate tried twice in that period to have a real conversation with him, not about work, not about logistics, but about how Daniel was actually doing, whether he was managing the time without his kids and the adjustment to the slower running and the aftermath of everything. Both times, Daniel redirected the conversation with a skill that Nate didn't recognize as skill. It just felt like Daniel being Daniel, private, capable, fine. The Tuesday lunches continued. The sandwich place, the beef jerky in the desk drawer, the comfortable, unremarkable rhythm of a 4-year friendship. Nate went home to his wife and his kids' sports schedules, and the particular fullness of a life that was genuinely busy. And the thing he had noticed about Daniel settled to the back of his mind, the way small concerns do when there is no obvious place to act on them. He had a family. He had work. Daniel was fine. But here was the thing Nate could not see from across the lunch table. The supply from Terry Grasso was becoming unreliable. Not disappearing, just fluctuating. Weeks where the pills arrived on schedule, followed by a dry week, followed by a reduced quantity at a higher price. The informal supply chain that Terry was connected to was itself dependent on sources that had their own instabilities, their own pressures, their own reasons for gaps in availability. Daniel began to feel the fluctuations in his body before the week's supply was gone. He had learned through the meticulous entries in his notebook the exact interval at which the absence began to register, not as knee pain, which had largely resolved, but as a creeping physical unease that started in his lower back and moved outward, a restlessness in his legs at night, a shortened temper he managed by removing himself from situations that might expose it. He managed all of this, precisely, quietly, alone. Somewhere in Ohio that same fall, not in Merton Heights, but in a county 60 miles southwest, in a town where a former steel plant had been converted into a storage facility, a different kind of supply chain was expanding to fill the gap that tightening prescription regulations had created. Street dealers who'd been moving diverted prescription pills found themselves facing the same supply pressure Daniel was experiencing, but from the other side. Their customers still needed what they had always needed. The pills were harder and more expensive to source. Heroin was not. It came from the same receptor in the brain, produced the same relief, and cost roughly a fifth of the price per dose. The dealers who made the switch began actively informing their customers of the alternative. Some customers declined, some did not. This transition, from prescription opioids to street heroin, was happening in dozens of Ohio counties simultaneously, moving through social networks and supply chains that had no connection to each other, except the shared economics of a gap in the market. Daniel Reeves, in his kitchen on Callaway Street, did not yet know any of this. He was still managing, still counting, still keeping the notebook. But the supply was getting worse. The gaps between available pills were lengthening, and the thing they were suppressing, that deep-rooted, long-postponed discomfort, was waiting in each gap with perfect patience. The notebook on his nightstand now had entries on both sides of the pages. He had started running out of room. The garden was the first thing that showed it. Not dramatically. No overnight collapse, no sudden abandonment. Just a gradual loosening of the attention Daniel had always brought to it. In July of the following year, a section of the tomato bed along the south fence developed a calcium deficiency that turned the bottom of the fruit black and soft. Any gardener paying close attention would have caught it 2 weeks earlier. Daniel caught it late, treated it partially, and the affected plants produced about a third of what they had the previous season. The paper bags of tomatoes still appeared on Greg Paulson's porch that August, but there were fewer of them, and Greg noticed they were smaller than usual. He thought it had been a dry summer. It had not been a particularly dry summer. The lawn edging along the front walk, which Daniel had always kept sharp enough to look intentional, grew soft and ragged through August and into September. Not neglected, just slightly, consistently behind. The kind of behind that accumulates when a person is managing something that consumes more attention than it shows. Inside the house, the notebook had been replaced. Not abandoned, replaced with a new one, a slightly larger format, bought at the same drugstore. The entries had changed in character over the preceding months, becoming less about pain management and more about supply logistics, where the next batch was coming from, what the timing looked like, how many days of buffer existed between the current supply and the next contact. It had become, without Daniel explicitly deciding this, a planning document for an operation he ran alone and told no one about. Terry Grasso's connection had thinned to near nothing by spring. The man Terry had been sourcing from had attracted attention from a county narcotics unit. Nothing that touched Terry directly, but enough to make him cautious and unavailable in the informal way he had previously been available. He told Daniel in the parking lot one Thursday afternoon that he couldn't help anymore. He said it without ceremony, the way people close doors they never officially opened. Daniel found another source within 10 days. This one was not a co-worker. This was a contact 2 steps further removed, reached through a casual acquaintance from a running club Daniel had briefly attended during his post-surgery recovery period. A man named Dennis, whom Daniel had spoken to perhaps 4 times in his life, knew someone. That someone knew someone else. The chain was short, but it moved Daniel one clear step away from the world of diverted prescriptions and into something with different rules and different exposure. The pills were now coming from a supply that mixed legitimate pharmaceutical product with counterfeit tablets pressed to look identical. Daniel did not know this. The counterfeit tablets varied in dosage in ways that the legitimate ones did not. Some were weaker than expected. Some were considerably stronger. He was calibrating against a standard that no longer existed. The parent-teacher conference happened in October. Owen's school, a 20-minute drive from Calloway Street, a Thursday evening event that Daniel had attended every previous year without exception, that he had once rearranged a work trip to make, that his name was already signed up for on the school's online portal. He called the school that afternoon and said he was unwell. He was not in the traditional sense unwell. He was in the middle of a gap between supply batches that had stretched to 5 days, and the physical symptoms of that gap. The back pain that had nothing to do with his spine, the leg restlessness that made sitting still feel like a task, the ambient nausea that arrived on day 3 and did not leave, had made a 20-minute drive and 90 minutes in a school gymnasium feel like something he could not construct a version of himself to perform. Owen's teacher noted the absence in the school system. She had met Daniel twice before and had found him attentive and present in a way that not all parents of second graders managed to be. Carol noticed the no-show because Owen mentioned it, not angrily, just as information, the way children report facts about the adults in their lives before they know which facts are significant. Carol texted Daniel that evening. He replied within 4 minutes with an apology and a rescheduling request. The reply was grammatically clean, appropriately contrite, and contained a specific alternate date. Carol read it and put her phone down. Something registered at the edge of her attention. Not suspicion exactly, but a small misalignment between the message and the man she had been married to for 11 years. She couldn't locate what was off. She moved on. There was dinner to finish, homework to supervise, her own work to catch up on. 3 weeks after the parent-teacher conference, Carol was dropping the kids off at Calloway Street on a Friday afternoon. She pulled into the driveway and watched Daniel come out to meet Owen and Maya, and something in the way he moved from the front door to the car stopped her in a way she couldn't immediately explain. He was present. He was engaged. He crouched down to the kids' level the way he always had. But there was something in his eyes that she had not seen before. Not absence, not distance. Something more like careful maintenance. The look of a person holding a specific expression in place rather than simply wearing it. She'd been married to him for 11 years. She recognized the effort. She said nothing. The kids went inside, the door closed. She backed out of the driveway and drove home and made herself not think about it for 3 days before it surfaced again in the middle of a Wednesday at work. And she still said nothing because she had no words for what she had seen that were specific enough to act on. Meanwhile, 60 miles southwest of Calloway Street, a shift had completed that had been building for 2 years. The county that had been the first in the region to show a spike in heroin-related emergency calls, a place called Harwick County, population 48,000, 3 hospitals, 1 methadone clinic that had a 6-week waiting list, had recorded 41 overdose deaths in the previous 12 months. That number, reported in a regional news brief that ran below the fold in the Columbus Dispatch, represented a 400% increase from 5 years prior. The majority of the victims had started with prescription opioids. The majority had been in their 30s and 40s. A significant portion had been employed at the time their addiction began. None of them had looked, from the outside, like what people pictured. The pipeline that was feeding those numbers ran through supply chains that had reorganized after prescription crackdowns, shifting toward heroin as the reliable, affordable, available option. The dealers along that pipeline were not, in the main, calculating strategists. They were people managing their own dependencies and supply pressures in real time, making rational decisions within the options available to them. When a customer's pill supply became inconsistent, the conversation about alternatives happened naturally, practically without drama. Daniel's new source had that conversation with him in February, not as a pitch, as information. The pills were getting harder to source consistently. There was something else that worked the same way, cost less, and was available reliably. Daniel had the information on a Tuesday. He sat with it for 9 days. 9 days in which he went to work, ate lunch with Nate on Tuesday, ran a slow 3 miles on Wednesday morning in the February cold, fed the dogs, answered emails, and gave no outward indication of the calculation happening inside the careful, private machinery of his mind. On the 9th day, he made a decision. He did not write it in the notebook. The first thing Daniel discovered about heroin was that it was consistent. Not in the way that word usually applies to a person's character or work habits. Consistent in a chemical, mechanical sense. The pills had been variable, different batches, different actual dosages despite the numbers stamped on them, different durations of effect that made the planning in his notebook increasingly approximate. Heroin, sourced from the same supply, behaved the same way each time. For a man who had built his entire adult life around reliable systems, this was not a trivial thing. He did not inject it. Not at first, not for a long time. He smoked it, a method that produces a slower, less intense onset, a fact that made it easier to maintain the mental framing that he was still managing something rather than being managed by it. The distinction mattered to him. The notebook entries resumed, more detailed than before, back on the clean side of the pages he hadn't yet filled. His running returned that spring. Not to half-marathon distances. His knee had healed well, but he had lost conditioning during the long gap. But to consistent 5-mile loops along the park trail, 5 mornings a week, the headlamp back on the cap. Greg Paulson, watching from number 43 at 5:45 on a Tuesday morning in March, felt that small, uncomplicated relief again and went back to bed. The garden was replanted in April with more care than the previous year. The tomato beds were amended properly. The irrigation line was rechecked and 2 emitters were replaced. By June, the plants were tall and dark green and clearly tended by someone paying attention. From the outside, Daniel Reeves had recovered. Nate Fowler believed this completely. He had watched his friend navigate an injury, a difficult recovery, and what Nate had vaguely understood to be a hard emotional period, and emerge on the other side functional and present. The Tuesday lunches had resumed their normal rhythm. Daniel was engaged at work, meeting his project deadlines, mentoring a new logistics coordinator who had started in January. At a company happy hour in April, Nate watched Daniel stand at the edge of a group of colleagues and make each person he talked to feel like they had his full attention. He seemed, in every way Nate could measure, like himself. What Nate was measuring without knowing it was performance, not deception in the deliberate sense. Daniel was not running a conscious con. He was doing what he had always done, managing his internal state so completely and so privately that the external version of himself remained reliable and available to the people around him. He had been doing this since he was 14 years old. The substance had changed. The skill had not. The custody arrangement continued without incident. Owen and Maya arrived on alternate Fridays and filled the house on Calloway Street with the particular noise and disorder of children who felt comfortable somewhere. Daniel cooked for them. Actual meals, not shortcuts. The kind of cooking that requires advanced preparation and attention to timing. He helped Maya with a science project about plant growth in March, using the garden beds as the experiment site. He drove Owen to a soccer tournament an hour outside Columbus on a Saturday in May and stood on the sideline in the rain for 90 minutes. He did all of this, fully, attentively, without visible cost. The cost was invisible because he had learned with precision how to time everything. Then the supply shifted again. In late spring, the source Daniel had been using for 8 months went quiet for 2 weeks without explanation. No message, no alternate contact, just absence. Daniel sat with the growing physical urgency of that absence and managed it by cutting his usage in half and then in half again, stretching what he had across the gap, tracking the math in the notebook with the same controlled handwriting he had always maintained. By day 10, the entries were sparser. The handwriting was still neat. His hands were steadier than most people's would have been under the same conditions, a fact that said something about how long he'd been managing this particular kind of pressure. The source came back at day 14 with a new contact number and a higher price and no explanation for the gap. Daniel paid the new price. He absorbed the information about the new number. He updated the relevant entry in the notebook and went to bed. This was when Linda Reeves called. She called on a Sunday evening from her apartment in Pittsburgh, where she worked as a dental hygienist and lived alone and talked to her brother approximately once every 3 weeks, in phone calls that lasted between 8 and 20 minutes. The calls had always had a specific texture, easy, familiar, a maintenance of closeness between two people who had survived the same childhood and understood each other in the shorthand way that produces. She was 2 years younger than Daniel. She had their mother's eyes and their father's stubbornness, and a directness that Daniel had always balanced against his own privacy. That Sunday, something in Daniel's voice was different enough that Linda noticed it through the phone. Not dramatically different, no slurring, no incoherence. Just a slightly unusual softness, a warmth that was marginally more available than usual. A quality she didn't have language for but registered in the way a person registers a room, where the temperature has shifted by 4 degrees. She asked if he was okay. He said he was fine, tired from work, managing. He asked about her week, and she answered, and the call lasted 14 minutes, and she hung up with a feeling she could not precisely name. She set her phone down. She thought about calling back. She did not call back. 4 days later, Nate invited Daniel to lunch, and Daniel arrived 9 minutes late. The first time in 4 years that had happened. He gave a reason involving a delayed conference call that Nate had no way to verify and no reason to question. They ate their sandwiches. Nate mentioned that one of his kids had made the travel soccer team. Daniel asked the right questions and remembered the kid's position and made the appropriate responses. The lunch was, by every observable standard, normal. Walking back to the office, Nate replayed it anyway. Something had snagged on him. Not anything Daniel said or did, but a quality of the 9-minute gap before he arrived, and then something in the first few minutes of his presence that felt like a person assembling themselves as they walked through the door rather than simply arriving. Nate had seen Daniel walk into rooms hundreds of times. He knew what that looked like. This had been something slightly different. He talked himself out of it by the time he reached his desk. 3 weeks after that lunch, Carol filed for a modification to the custody arrangement. Not because of drugs. She still had no specific knowledge, only that persistent low-resolution unease from the driveway moment months earlier. The modification she requested was modest. She wanted the alternating weekend arrangement reviewed, citing what she described in the filing as Daniel's recent inconsistency in availability. The parent-teacher conference absence was listed. 2 unreturned calls were listed. 1 instance of a pickup running 45 minutes late. Individually, each item was minor. Together they formed a shape. Daniel received the custody modification papers on a Thursday and sat with them at the kitchen table for a long time without opening anything else. He responded through a lawyer 2 weeks later, contesting the characterization and providing documentation of his attendance at Owen's soccer tournament and Maya's science fair and 6 months of school pickups completed on time. The documentation was thorough and accurate. The lawyer was competent. The modification was ultimately not granted. But Carol had been watching, and now she was watching with a specific question in mind, even if she couldn't yet name what she was looking for. Meanwhile, in Merton Heights itself, not 60 miles away, not in Harwick County, but within the actual boundaries of the suburb where Calloway Street sat, the overdose numbers had begun to register. A 17-year-old from the high school 2 miles east had been revived with naloxone in a park bathroom in June. The local paper ran a story. A retired teacher named Harold Voss, 63 years old, had died in his home in August. The official cause listed in his obituary was cardiac arrest, but his family knew what the toxicology report said and told nobody. The Merton Heights Community Facebook group had a thread in September about prescription drug disposal that got 47 comments and was then archived. The suburb was not insulated. It never had been. It had simply not been looking. Greg Paulson, at number 43, was not looking either. He watched the headlamp go down the street at 5:45 and noted the garden's recovery, and waved from the driveway when Daniel came to get his mail. In September, he noticed that the light in Daniel's kitchen was on at 3 in the morning. He was up because his back was bothering him again, the same back that had introduced him to Daniel's running 4 years earlier. The kitchen light was on. He registered it as insomnia, or early work, or one of the private habits people maintain in the unseen hours of their own homes. It was on 3 nights in a row. On the 4th night, Greg's back had improved and he slept through, and the light on Daniel's kitchen was no longer something he was tracking. Linda Reeves, in Pittsburgh, was also not tracking it anymore. The Sunday call had receded in her memory. Daniel had called her the following week with the same ease as always, and whatever she had heard in his voice had not repeated, and she had filed the feeling away in the category of things she had imagined. Then in late September, Daniel left her a voicemail. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Linda missed the call because she was out. She saw the notification when she got home, set down her keys, and listened. The voicemail was 4 minutes and 20 seconds long. What Daniel said in those 4 minutes was not a confession, not a cry for help in any direct sense. It was a phone call that moved the way a person moves when they are walking along the edge of something, and are aware of it but not yet ready to step back. He talked about Owen's recent soccer games, about a work project that had gone well, about the garden and what he was planning to plant differently next year. And then, in the last 90 seconds, he said something about their father, about Roy, about a specific winter in the house in Dayton when the heat had been low, and the three of them had stayed in the living room together to share warmth, and what it had been like to be in that room, and what it had felt like when it ended. Linda sat on her couch and listened to her brother talk about their father in a way he had never talked about him before, quietly, specifically, without performance. And when the voicemail ended, she sat in the silence for a full minute. She played it again. She did not call him back that evening. She told herself she would call the next day, when she had time to respond the way the call deserved. The next day was busy. She sent a text instead. "Just checking in. How are you? Talk soon." Daniel responded within an hour with a thumbs-up emoji and a note that said work was hectic, but he'd call soon. She put her phone down and went back to her week. That voicemail sat on her phone for 4 more weeks. Nate Fowler found out on a Thursday afternoon in early October, and he found out alone, and he found out in the worst possible way. Not from Daniel, but from a document he was never supposed to need to read. It started with a routine administrative task. Meridian Freight Solutions was conducting a standard employee records audit, the kind that happened every 3 years, triggered by an insurance renewal cycle, requiring HR to verify that all personnel files were complete and current. Nate, as a senior project manager, had been given temporary access to the shared HR drive to confirm documentation for the team members under his supervision. Daniel was not technically under Nate's supervision. Their roles sat at the same level on the organizational chart. But Daniel's file had been placed in the wrong folder. A clerical error, a misclick, something that took less than a second to happen and would take years to fully account for. Nate opened the folder. He saw Daniel's name. He should have closed it. He read it instead. The document that stopped him was not recent. It had been flagged during Daniel's background check when he was hired at Meridian 6 years earlier, a disclosure from a previous employer, required under the terms of Daniel's hiring agreement, noting that he had taken a formal leave of absence from that company for medical reasons. The leave had lasted 32 days. It had occurred 8 years before he moved to Calloway Street. The medical reason listed, in the dry and specific language of HR documentation, was inpatient treatment for alcohol dependency. 32 days, 8 years ago. Nate sat at his desk and read the paragraph 3 times. Then he looked at the date on the document, then at the window, then back at the document. The office around him continued at its normal pace. Keyboards, a phone ringing 2 desks over, someone laughing at something in the break room. None of it registered. 8 years of sobriety. That was what the timeline meant. Daniel had left that treatment program, rebuilt his life in whatever way he had rebuilt it, moved to Calloway Street, planted the garden, run the half marathons, maintained the 5:45 departures, kept the corkboard with the race times in the garage, and never told anyone. Not Nate. Not, as far as Nate knew, Carol. Not a single person on Calloway Street. The running, the garden, the rigid daily structure, the obsessive consistency, the way Daniel could be in a room full of people and remain somehow unreachable at the centre of it. Nate had spent 4 years attributing these qualities to personality, to the particular character of a private and disciplined man. He had been looking at the architecture of a recovery and calling it a character trait. He sat with this for a long time, And then, because the human mind moves toward explanation even when explanation makes things worse, another thing slid into place. The injury, the surgery, the oxycodone prescription, the recovery that had seemed too smooth, the quality he had described to his wife as Daniel seeming better than before the injury. A man in long-term sobriety from alcohol, given a post-surgical opioid prescription by a doctor who had no idea about his history, in a state whose medical record systems were not yet linked in a way that would have flagged the risk. Nate closed the folder. He opened it again. He closed it again and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was the closest he ever came, in an office setting, to not functioning. He took out his phone. He started typing a message to Daniel, then stopped. He needed to think about what he knew and what he didn't, and what it meant to act on one without the other. He needed to be careful in the way that mattered here. Not careful in the professional sense, but careful in the sense of a person who understood that the next step could determine whether a door opened or closed permanently. He put the phone back in his pocket. He picked it up again 20 minutes later. He drove home without sending anything. His wife found him at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, still in his work clothes, and asked what had happened. He told her, because he told her most things, and she listened and was quiet for a while, and then asked what he was going to do. Nate said he didn't know. She said that Daniel needed to know that someone knew. Nate said he understood that. She said it again, slightly differently. He went to bed and did not sleep until after 2. Now the entire shape of Daniel's story had changed, not just in Nate's understanding of it, in the actual fact of what it had been. Everything the neighbours on Calloway Street had seen and interpreted was still true in its details, but the meaning of those details was completely different. The man who had seemed like the healthiest person on the street had not arrived at that health naturally. He had constructed it piece by piece, over 8 years, out of the raw materials of a sobriety that nobody knew he was maintaining. The running was not fitness, it was medicine. The garden was not a hobby, it was an anchor. The rigid schedule, the 5:45 departures, the corkboard in the garage, these were not the expressions of a disciplined personality. They were the infrastructure of a person who knew, from hard experience, that without structure the alternative was available and waiting. He had built a life-size system for keeping one specific thing at bay, and he had maintained it for 8 years without anyone around him knowing that was what they were looking at. And then a downhill curve at mile 9 of a half-marathon had taken the running away. Not just the running, the entire load-bearing architecture of 8 years of recovery, dismantled in one sideways movement of a knee on a trail outside Columbus on a Saturday morning in April. The surgery had been the obvious crisis. What followed was the one nobody saw coming, including Daniel. There is a specific vulnerability that long-term recovery creates that medical literature began documenting in the early 2000s, but that had not, by the time Daniel was handed his post-operative prescription, filtered down into the standard protocols of orthopedic surgery. A person who has been in sobriety for years has not resolved their neurological sensitivity to addictive substances. They have simply not activated it. The brain's reward circuitry, which in susceptible individuals responds to alcohol or opioids with a disproportionate and persistent urgency, does not normalize during years of abstinence. It waits. When oxycodone arrived in Daniel's system after 8 years of careful absence, it did not encounter a brain that had healed. It encountered one that recognized the signal immediately, completely, with the full intensity of every year that had passed since the last time. The surgeon who prescribed those 30 tablets had no way of knowing any of this. He had not been told. There was no flag in Daniel's medical record, because Daniel had never disclosed the alcohol treatment to any physician in Ohio. He had built a wall between that history and his current life, and maintained it for 8 years, and the wall had protected him from the kind of well-meaning disclosure that sometimes complicates a person's professional and personal circumstances, and it had also made him invisible to the one system that might have caught what was happening. This was the structure of it. Not a moral failure, not a weakness, not a bad decision made by a careless man. A specific sequence of medical, personal, and systemic factors that aligned in a particular order in a particular person at a particular moment. Nate Fowler knew none of the clinical history on that Thursday night. He knew only what the HR document had told him, and what his own 4 years of observation had been quietly accumulating without his permission. He knew that the door was still open, Daniel was alive, was working, was running, was maintaining something, and that the HR file changed what it meant to be a friend sitting 2 desks away, with information that the other person did not know he had. He picked up his phone the following morning and typed a message. Short, careful, pitched to sound casual in the way that only very deliberate messages sound casual. It said that he wanted to catch up properly, not just Tuesday lunch, maybe dinner sometime, bring the families. He sent it before he could revise it further. Daniel responded in 40 minutes. He said that sounded good. He checked the calendar. Things had been hectic, but he was doing well. Nate read the response and put his phone face down on his desk. He did not push for a date. He told himself he would try again next week when he had figured out exactly what he wanted to say. He would find the right moment, the right approach, the specific words that would open something rather than close it. He had more time. Daniel was functioning. The door was still open. What Nate did not know, what he had no way of knowing, because the information existed in a supply chain he had no access to, was that the heroin reaching Daniel on Calloway Street had begun arriving from a different source than it had 2 months earlier. The original contact had shifted his supply upward, sourcing from a larger operation based out of Cleveland that was moving product cut and mixed at a facility that had no quality control in any meaningful sense. The batches were inconsistent in a new way, not in the variable dosage way the counterfeit pills had been, but in terms of what else was in them. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid approximately 50 times more potent than heroin by weight. It is used medically in controlled hospital settings for severe pain management. It began appearing in the illicit drug supply in Ohio around 2015, initially as a deliberate additive used by some dealers to increase potency, then increasingly as a contaminant present in batches that had passed through mixing operations where multiple substances were processed in the same space without separation. By the fall of the year Daniel died, an estimated 40% of the heroin circulating in central Ohio contained some level of fentanyl contamination. Most of the people using it had no idea. Most of the dealers distributing it had no idea. The contamination was invisible, inconsistent, and unpredictable, present in one batch and absent from the next, with no external marker that distinguished the two. Daniel's notebook, still maintained in the same careful handwriting, had begun to include a new notation in the margin of certain entries, a small question mark beside the recorded dose and effect, indicating a response that didn't match the expected pattern. The question marks had started appearing 6 weeks before he died. He thought he was miscalculating. He adjusted his estimates and kept the notebook current and went to work and ran his miles, and did not call Nate back about dinner. The last week of Daniel Reeves's life looked, from the outside, like any other week. He ran on Monday morning, 4 miles, the park loop back by 6:15. He showered, made coffee in the steel pour-over he had owned for 3 years, and was at his desk at Meridian by 8:40. He submitted a project status report that afternoon that his supervisor would later describe as thorough and ahead of schedule. He bought groceries on the way home, the reusable bags, both handles looped over his forearms, and cooked a meal that left the kitchen smelling of garlic and olive oil well into the evening. Tuesday he had lunch with Nate, the sandwich place. 45 minutes. Nate had been carrying the HR file information for 2 weeks by then. He had drafted and deleted 4 versions of what he wanted to say to Daniel and had not sent any of them. At that Tuesday lunch, he came closer than he had before. There was a moment toward the end of the meal when the conversation reached a natural pause, and Nate had the words assembled and ready. And he looked at Daniel across the table, and Daniel looked back at him with an expression that was open and calm and entirely composed, and Nate let the moment pass. He told himself there would be a better one. They walked back to the office. Daniel held the door. He went to his desk and answered 3 emails before the afternoon was over. Nate watched him from across the open plan floor and thought about what he knew, and what he still didn't know how to do with it. Wednesday was Owen and Maya's last overnight of the month, a school night visit, permitted under the custody arrangement for the midweek Wednesday before a long weekend. Carol dropped them at 4:30. Daniel had snacks ready on the kitchen counter, the specific snacks each child preferred, bought that morning, and the evening was ordinary in the way that full evenings with children are ordinary. Homework, dinner, a disagreement about screen time that resolved itself, Maya falling asleep on the couch at 9 and being carried to her room. Daniel sat in the living room after both kids were asleep and the house was quiet. The television was on at low volume. The older dog was at his feet. The younger one was somewhere in the back of the house. He looked, in that moment, like a man at rest. Carol picked them up Thursday morning at 7. Owen was half asleep and had his shoes on the wrong feet. Maya had her backpack on before Carol knocked. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched them get into the car, and Carol looked up from buckling Owen's seatbelt and caught Daniel's expression. Not the composed maintenance expression she'd seen in the driveway months before, but something quieter and less managed, a look she had not seen on his face in a long time and could not immediately place. She placed it 2 days later, sitting alone in her kitchen, and the placement hit her like a weight dropped from height. It was the look he had worn in the last year of their marriage, in the private moments when he didn't know she was watching. Not unhappy, not desperate, just very, very tired of something he couldn't name. She did not know that on Thursday morning, at the moment she was reading that expression in the doorway, she was looking at her children's father for the last time. Thursday at work, Daniel was unremarkable. He answered his email. He reviewed a vendor contract. He made a cup of tea in the break room at 3 in the afternoon, something he rarely did, and stood at the window for 6 minutes looking at the parking lot. A colleague who passed through the break room during those 6 minutes and saw him there would recall it later, not because anything was visibly wrong, but because it was the kind of moment that only becomes significant in retrospect. A man standing at a window with a cup of tea, looking at nothing particular. He drove home. He fed the dogs. He didn't run Friday morning. This was the only deviation from his schedule that final week. The missed Friday run. Greg Paulson was awake at 5:45, his back bothering him again, and he noticed the absence of the headlamp. He registered it as a rest day, or a slight illness, or any of the ordinary explanations for a small break in a pattern. He went back to lie down. Friday evening was quiet on Calloway Street. The temperature had dropped to the low 40s. Most of the houses had their lights on by 5:30, the early dark of October pulling everyone inside. Daniel's lights were on. His car was in the driveway. The garden beds had been cleared for the season, the cedar frames bare, the irrigation line capped and coiled. What happened inside number 44 on the evening of Friday, October 15th, was reconstructed later from physical evidence and the toxicology report, and the specific details the paramedics noted in their incident report. Daniel used a batch he had received 4 days earlier. The same source, the same contact number, the same arrangement that had been consistent for months. Nothing about the transaction had indicated a different product. The batch looked identical to the previous one. It was not. The fentanyl concentration in that particular portion of the supply was significantly higher than anything Daniel had previously encountered. High enough that the amount he used, calibrated carefully against his established tolerance, and recorded in the notebook with the same precision as always, was lethal before he had time to register that something was wrong. He was sitting in the armchair in the living room. The television was on, a nature documentary, the volume set to 11, which was the volume he usually kept it at in the evenings. The remote was in his right hand. The older dog was somewhere near the couch. The younger one, the black terrier, was beside the armchair. His phone was on the kitchen counter. At 9:47 that evening, Nate Fowler sent him a text message. It had taken Nate 4 days to write it after their Tuesday lunch. Not a casual dinner invitation this time, but the real version, the one that said he needed to talk, that he knew something and cared about Daniel and wasn't going anywhere, that the door was open. Nate had typed and deleted it twice before finally sending it at 9:47, while sitting on his own couch with his own television on across town. He watched the message show as delivered. He waited for it to show as read. It never did. At 6:51 the following morning, Saturday, Greg Paulson's back pulled him awake again. He lay in the dark for a few minutes, then got up and went to the kitchen for water. The window above the sink faced Calloway Street. He looked out without particular intention and saw the front door of number 44 standing open. Not forced, not broken, just open. The screen door shifting in the morning wind, tapping against the frame. The older dog was on the porch, sitting, facing the street. Greg stood at his window for a moment. Then he put down his glass, picked up his phone and called 911. The dispatcher asked him to describe what he was seeing. He described it. The door, the dog, the stillness of the house, the fact that Daniel Reeves ran every morning at 5:45 without exception and had not appeared. The dispatcher kept him on the line. 2 minutes later, Greg heard the distant sound of a vehicle turning onto Calloway Street, and he watched through his window as the ambulance came around the curve at the end of the road. No sirens. The paramedics were inside for 11 minutes. Greg stood at his window for all 11 of them. He was still holding his phone, the call disconnected now, his coffee unmade, the October light just beginning to come up grey and flat over the rooftops of the street. He did not look away from the door of number 44. When the paramedics came back out, they came back out slowly, and their posture told Greg everything before he had fully processed what their posture meant. The call to Meridian Freight Solutions came at 8:30 that Saturday morning, made by the responding officer who had found Daniel's emergency contact information on a card in his wallet. The contact listed was Nate Fowler, entered there years ago, updated once, never changed. Nate's phone rang while he was making coffee. His wife was at the table. His kids were still asleep upstairs. He answered it. He stood in his kitchen and listened to the officer's voice and looked at his wife, who watched his face go through something she had never seen it go through before, and would never see it go through again in quite the same way. He set his phone down on the counter when the call ended. He didn't speak for almost a minute. Then he picked the phone back up and looked at the text he'd sent the night before, delivered, unread, 9:47 p.m., and set it face down. His coffee finished brewing. The sound of it was very loud in the kitchen. Carol received the call 20 minutes later. She'd been up since 7, already on her second cup, already dressed, already halfway through the particular productive momentum of a Saturday morning when both kids were elsewhere. She went still when the officer gave her the information, and stayed still for a long time after the call ended. Then she walked to the hallway and stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up toward where Owen and Maya were sleeping, and stayed there without moving for several minutes before going back to the kitchen. She would have to go up those stairs, she knew that. She was not yet ready to do it. In Pittsburgh, Linda Reeves's phone rang at 9:15. She was still in bed. She saw the Pittsburgh area code and answered it, thinking it was a local number she hadn't saved. A dentist's office, a utility, something routine. The voice on the other end was a Columbus police officer who had been given her number from Daniel's phone. She listened. She didn't speak during the call except once near the end to confirm that she understood what she'd been told. She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed in the silence of her apartment, and her phone was still in her hand and on it. 3 screens down in her voicemail inbox was a recording that was 4 minutes and 20 seconds long that she had been meaning to respond to for 4 weeks. She did not listen to it again that morning. She got in her car. The drive from Pittsburgh to Columbus takes just under 3 hours on a clear day. Linda drove it in 2 hours and 40 minutes, arriving on Callaway Street at just past noon. She pulled into the driveway of number 44 and put the car in park and sat there, engine off, looking at the front door, closed now, the screen door latched. The older dog had been taken inside by a neighbour. The street was quiet. A Saturday in October, the particular stillness of a neighbourhood that has absorbed something and not yet processed it. She sat in that driveway for 53 minutes before she went inside. Nobody on Callaway Street measured it, but Greg Paulson, watching from his window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, saw the car in the driveway and the woman sitting motionless inside it for the better part of an hour, and he understood what that kind of stillness costs, and he left her to it. The notebook was on the nightstand. The last entry was dated Thursday. The funeral was held on a Thursday, 11 days after the ambulance came down Callaway Street. It was a small service. Daniel had not been a person with a large social footprint, and the people who came were the people who had actually known him, rather than people who knew of him. Nate and his wife sat 3 rows back. Greg Paulson came alone and sat near the rear. Several of Daniel's colleagues from Meridian filled the middle rows. Owen sat between Carol and Linda in the front, wearing a tie he had put on himself, the knot slightly off-centre. Maya held Carol's hand through the entire service and did not let go once. Linda spoke. She had prepared something written, but she set the paper aside after the first sentence and spoke without it, which made what she said more precise and harder to listen to. She talked about her brother's specific qualities, not general ones, not eulogy approximations, but the actual granular details of who Daniel Reeves had been. The way he remembered the names of people he had met only once, the bags of tomatoes left without knocking, the race times on the corkboard, each one written in the same black marker, each one a record of a morning he had gotten up before the street was awake and gone out into the dark alone. She did not mention the alcohol treatment. She did not mention the pills or the heroin or the notebook on the nightstand. Carol found out about the alcohol treatment during the reception afterward, in the church hall, standing near the window with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Linda told her, not as a disclosure, not as an explanation, but because it had come up naturally in a conversation about Daniel's years in Dayton, and Linda had assumed, until the expression on Carol's face made clear otherwise, that Carol had always known. Carol set her coffee cup down on the windowsill very carefully. She asked Linda one question. How long ago? Linda told her. 32 days of treatment. 8 years of sobriety after. Sobriety that had ended not with a choice, but with a prescription from a surgeon who'd been given no reason to know what opioids would do to this particular patient's brain. Carol looked out the window at the parking lot for a moment. Then she looked back at Linda and said something quietly that Linda would not repeat to anyone, and they stood together at that window for a long time without speaking. 11 years of marriage. She had not known. The question Carol sat with in the weeks that followed was not about blame. It was a more specific and more difficult question about what it means to know a person. She had known Daniel's habits, his preferences, his professional patterns, his relationship with their children, his face in unguarded moments, the particular way he organised a kitchen. She had known him in the daily and cumulative way that marriage produces, and she had not known the central organising fact of his adult life, the thing around which every habit and preference and daily structure had been arranged. What that meant about the nature of knowing someone was a question she turned over for months without resolution. Nate Fowler did not stay for the reception. He drove home after the service and sat in his car in his own driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. The text message, delivered, unread, 9:47, had become a fact he carried in a specific location inside his chest, the way a person carries a stone in a pocket they keep reaching into. His wife had told him, in the first days after Daniel's death, that the timing was not his fault, and that nothing in what he had known could have guaranteed a different outcome. She was not wrong. He understood that she was not wrong. Understanding it, and being free of it, were different things. He started attending a support group for family members and friends of overdose victims. A Thursday evening meeting in a church basement in Columbus. 12 to 20 people depending on the week, folding chairs, bad coffee and styrofoam cups. He did not speak for the first 3 meetings. On the 4th, he told the group about the text message. He described sending it at 9:47, watching it show as delivered, waiting for it to show as read. He described making coffee the next morning when the phone rang. He said that in his mind the 9:47 timestamp had become a kind of fixed point around which everything else in his life now orbited, and that he was trying to figure out how to let it be what it was, a thing that had happened in the order it had happened, without it becoming the only thing. The group was quiet when he finished. A woman across the circle who had lost her adult daughter 14 months earlier looked at him and nodded once, slowly. The kind of nod that means I know exactly where that stone sits. He kept going back. Every Thursday. Same basement, same bad coffee, same circle of people carrying different versions of the same specific weight. Linda Reeves drove back to Pittsburgh 2 weeks after the funeral, after she had helped Carol sort through the house on Callaway Street and arrange for the dogs to be transported and the lease terminated and the belongings distributed or stored. She took 3 things for herself: a photograph of Daniel at the finish line of his first half marathon, the paper bag he had left on a neighbour's porch the previous August. She found it still folded in a kitchen drawer, and the notebook from the nightstand. She read the notebook in one sitting, the night she got back to Pittsburgh at her kitchen table. It took her 2 hours. The entries were exactly what they appeared to be: precise, functional, the careful record of a man managing a system he believed he had under control. There was no despair in it, no self-pity, no dramatic language of any kind. The handwriting was consistent and clear from the first entry to the last. If she'd been shown a single page without context, she would have described it as the work of a meticulous and organised person. She closed it when she finished, and sat with her hands flat on the cover for a long time. The voicemail was still on her phone. She had not deleted it. She had not listened to it again since the morning she drove to Columbus. Some evenings she would look at the notification in her voicemail inbox, 4 minutes and 20 seconds, 3 weeks before he died, and decide whether to open it, and then decide not to, and set the phone face down. She was not ready. She might not be ready for a long time. The voicemail was still there, waiting with the same patience that everything in Daniel's life had always waited for him to be ready to address it. She was not sure she would ever delete it. 6 weeks after the funeral, the Ohio State Legislature passed an updated version of the prescription monitoring program that had been in partial implementation for several years. The new version required real-time data sharing between pharmacies and physicians across the state. closing the gap that had allowed patients to receive opioid prescriptions from multiple providers without any single provider knowing the full picture. Medical advocacy groups called it a significant step. The bill's sponsors noted that it would have flagged Daniel's situation at the point of his post-surgical prescription, his prior treatment, his dependency history, the specific risk that opioid exposure represented for him. If the system had existed then, and if his treatment record had been in it. 2 conditions. Both had failed. The system had not existed, and his record had not been in it. The monitoring program passed with broad bipartisan support and was signed into law in December. Within 18 months, opioid prescriptions in Ohio fell by 22%. County health officials cited the reduction as evidence of the program's effectiveness. The overdose death rate in Ohio increased by 11% over the same period. This was not a contradiction. It was the predictable consequence of a demand that did not disappear when its legal supply was restricted. The people who had been dependent on prescription opioids and could no longer obtain them did not stop needing what the opioids had been providing. They found other sources. The other sources, heroin, fentanyl, combinations that had no quality control and no consistent dosage, were considerably more lethal than the pills had been. The monitoring program had solved the visible part of the problem and accelerated the invisible part. The families in Nate's Thursday group kept growing. New people, new Thursday evenings, new versions of the same stone in the same pocket. Carol, 6 months after the funeral, had a conversation with Owen's school counsellor that she had been putting off for weeks. Owen had been quieter than usual, more interior, occasionally short-tempered in ways that were new. The normal processing of grief in a 13-year-old, the counsellor said, manageable with time and consistency and the right kind of attention. Owen had not asked many questions about how his father died. He had asked one in the car 3 days after, not to Carol but staring straight ahead at the road, whether his dad had known it was going to happen. Carol had told him no. She believed that was true. Owen had nodded and looked out the window and not asked again. He had, in the months following, taken up running, not casually, with the specific, slightly excessive consistency of a person who has discovered that the motion does something necessary. He ran in the mornings before school, which required getting up at 5:45 to have enough time before the bus. Carol noticed the timing but said nothing about it. He joined the school cross-country team in the spring and trained without being asked and never missed a practice. At his first official meet in late April, 6 months after Daniel's death, Owen ran the 2-mile course in a time that placed him 4th overall in his age group. He was not yet 14. After crossing the finish line, he bent forward with his hands on his knees for a moment the way runners do, and then straightened up and looked around the field at the other kids and the parents on the sideline, and the trees at the edge of the park already going green with early spring. Inside the front pocket of his running shirt, pinned there with a single safety pin, was a racing bib. Not his own. His was on the outside of the shirt assigned by the meet organisers. This one was older, the paper slightly stiff, the number faded from a single wash, bib number 2847, from the Scioto Valley Spring Run, the half marathon where Daniel Reeves had torn his ACL at mile 9 on a downhill curve on a Saturday morning in April, 3 years before his son stood on a cross-country course and finished 4th. Carol saw it when Owen took off his shirt after the meet. She recognised it. She did not say anything. She folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket and drove home. What Owen would carry forward, the running, the discipline, the specific inheritance of a father who had built his survival around a single repeated motion, was not yet fully visible. He was 13. He had a long time ahead of him in which to find out what he was made of and what he had been given, and what he had been left to figure out alone. The house on Calloway Street was listed for rent in January. A young couple moved in by March. New to Merton Heights, new to the street, no knowledge of who had lived there before them. They looked at the cedar garden beds along the south fence and the drip irrigation line capped and coiled near the spigot, and told the landlord they were interested in gardening and asked if they could use the beds. The landlord said yes. Greg Poulsen from across the street watched them move in on a Saturday morning and tried to think of what he would say when he introduced himself. He had been trying to figure that out since January, since the house went on the market, since the sign went up, and he had stood at his window and looked at the empty driveway of number 44 and tried to locate the right way to hold what had happened on this street in the past 6 months. He had not found it yet. He was not sure the right way existed. What he knew, what had lodged in him, in the way that certain things lodge and do not move, was that he had watched a man leave for a run 400 and something times without once asking where he was running from. That question had not been available to him then. It was available to him now, and it had arrived too late to matter in the way it might have mattered, and that was a specific kind of knowledge that he would carry on this street for as long as he lived on it. The new couple finished moving in by evening. Their lights were on. The street looked the way it always looked. Somewhere in the Thursday night group, Nate Fowler was in a folding chair with a styrofoam cup, listening to someone he had never met describe a text message that had also arrived too late. The ambulance came without sirens. That detail, which had registered on Calloway Street as simply the first observable fact of a Saturday morning, meant something specific to the people who worked inside it. Paramedics run sirens on the way to a call, to clear traffic, to move fast, to close the distance between where they are and where someone needs them. They do not run sirens on the way back when there is no longer a distance that matters. The silence on that October morning was not incidental. It was information, delivered to an entire street before anyone had been officially told anything. Greg Poulsen had understood it at his kitchen window. He had understood it the way the body understands certain things before the mind has finished processing them. A coldness, a stillness, the coffee not made and the glass of water still in his hand. He had stood there for 11 minutes watching a door that nobody came back through in a hurry, and he had known. He had known, and he had also known nothing. Both things were true simultaneously, and the distance between them was the length of 4 years of early mornings and headlamps and paper bags of tomatoes, and a driveway wave that had never once carried a question worth asking. Now consider what that Saturday morning looked like from every other angle at once. Nate Fowler's unread text, glowing on a phone screen in a kitchen 60 feet from an armchair, where a man was already beyond reach. Carol standing at the bottom of her stairs, unable to go up. The particular geometry of that moment. Her children sleeping above her. The knowledge below her. The staircase between. Linda on the highway from Pittsburgh. 3 hours of road ahead of her, the voicemail sitting in her phone like something with a pulse. Owen's soccer cleats by the door, mud still on them from the previous weekend. Maya's science project on the kitchen counter at Carol's house, the one about plant growth, the one Daniel had helped design. Every one of these details existed at the same moment. 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday in October. The ambulance turning onto Calloway Street with its lights on and its siren off. The batch of heroin that killed Daniel Reeves was traced, in the weeks following his death, by a Columbus narcotics unit working backward through the supply chain that had been under partial surveillance for several months. The trace moved from the contact who had supplied Daniel, upward through 2 intermediate distributors, to a mixing operation in a warehouse on the eastern edge of Cleveland that had processed an estimated 40 kilograms of product over an 8-month period before it was shut down in a federal operation in January. During those 8 months, that single operation had contributed to at least 31 confirmed overdose deaths across 4 states: Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 64. 4 of them died in the same week as Daniel Reeves, from the same contaminated batch in 4 different cities, none of whom had ever been in the same room as each other, none of whom had any connection beyond a supply chain they didn't know they shared. None of them looked like what people picture when they hear the word addict. A 26-year-old nurse in Youngstown who had started using after a back injury, sustained lifting a patient. A 58-year-old retired school principal in Wheeling, West Virginia, whose dependency had begun with post-surgical pain medication after a hip replacement. A 39-year-old electrician in Pittsburgh, Linda City, 4 miles from her apartment, who had managed his use invisibly for 2 years while maintaining his license, his marriage, and a perfect attendance record at his son's Little League games. And Daniel Reeves, 41, on Callaway Street in Merton Heights, Ohio, who had run a headlamp down a dark street at 5:45 in the morning for 4 years, while the people who watched him go thought they were watching a healthy man. 4 people, 1 week, 1 source. The warehouse in Cleveland that produced that batch was not an anomaly. It was one node in a supply network that had expanded specifically to fill the gap created when prescription opioids became harder to obtain. It would be replaced within weeks of its closure by operations in different locations using different personnel and the same basic economics. The demand that had built up over 15 years of aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, surgical prescribing practices, and inadequate addiction treatment infrastructure did not resolve when a warehouse was raided. It redistributed. Callaway Street the following spring looked the way it always looked when the cold finally broke. The new couple at number 44 had spent the winter planning the garden. By April they had the raised beds amended and planted. Different things than Daniel had grown, different arrangement, but the same cedar frames, the same drip line running from the south spigot. Their tomato seedlings went in during the 2nd week of May, started indoors in small pots that lined the sill of the kitchen window through March and April. The same kitchen where a light had burned at 3 in the morning 3 nights in a row the previous fall. Greg Paulson watched the planting from across the street on a Saturday afternoon, and then stopped watching and went back inside, because some things are not available to be observed from a distance and some things are. What he kept returning to in the months following was not the morning of the ambulance or even the weeks of slow revelation that had followed it. He kept returning to an earlier moment, a specific morning, unremarkable at the time, when he'd been standing at his kitchen window and had seen Daniel come back from his run and stop at the end of the driveway. Just stop there for perhaps 30 seconds, looking back down the street in the direction he'd come from. Not catching his breath. He was past needing to do that after a 5-mile loop, just standing at the edge of his own property, looking back at something Greg couldn't see, before turning and going inside. Greg had clocked it as nothing. A man pausing at the end of a run. Normal. He had replayed it perhaps 200 times since October, and still could not say what it had been. 30 seconds at the end of a driveway, looking back at a street. A man who had built 8 years of survival around a single daily motion, standing at the edge of it, looking at something in the direction he'd come from. What Daniel Reeves had been looking at, what was in that direction, down the curve of Callaway Street, in the early morning before the neighbourhood was awake, was nothing visible. Greg knew that. The street went left toward the park trail, past the house where the retired couple lived, past the street light that had been flickering since August and that nobody had reported to the city. Just a street, just the ordinary geometry of a neighbourhood in the early morning. But a man who runs the way Daniel ran is not running at the street. He is running at something that has no address, something that follows at a consistent distance behind regardless of pace, something that the motion keeps just far enough back to be manageable. Greg did not know what that thing was for Daniel. He had never asked. The tomatoes on the south side of number 44 came up in July. Nobody had planted them. The new couple had put in peppers and zucchini along that bed, but in the far corner, where Daniel's original plants had self-seeded into the soil over 4 summers, the tomatoes came back on their own. 3 volunteers, growing through the mulch without being asked, without being tended, reaching toward the south-facing light with the particular insistence of things that do not know they weren't expected. The new couple found them in late June and let them grow. By August, they were producing. Linda Reeves, in Pittsburgh, still had the voicemail on her phone. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. A Sunday afternoon in September. Her brother's voice, the story about their father and the winter in Dayton, and the living room where the 3 of them had stayed close to share the heat. She had not deleted it. She had not decided what to do with it. Some evenings she looked at it and some evenings she didn't, and the notification sat there in her voicemail inbox with the same patience that Daniel had always brought to everything. The garden, the notebook, the 5:45 mornings, the long and careful management of something he carried alone. She would listen to it again someday. She was certain of that. She just had not yet found the version of herself that was ready to hear his voice, say the things he said in those last 90 seconds, the things about their father and the cold winter and what it had felt like when the warmth ended. She suspected that version of herself was still on the way. Owen ran his second cross-country meet in May and placed second. After the race, standing on the field with his hands on his knees, he reached into the front pocket of his shirt and checked that the racing bib was still there. Bib 2847. Slightly damp now from the run, the number faded but legible. He straightened up and looked at the tree line at the edge of the park, the same posture his father had held at the end of a driveway on an early morning on Callaway Street, looking at something in the direction he had come from. Owen was 13 years old. He did not yet know what he was running from, or whether he was running from anything at all, or whether the distinction mattered as much as the running itself. He had a long road ahead of him to find out. The street was quiet. The tomatoes were coming in.